The grand auction hall buzzed with an air of disinterest, a cavernous space filled with the murmurs of wealthy buyers and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. The spotlight, harsh and unyielding, fell upon a lone figure lying motionless in the center of the ring. A chestnut stallion, his once glossy coat now marred with deep, jagged scars that told silent stories of hardship and neglect. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, cleared his throat and attempted to spark interest. "Who will start the bidding? Do I hear an offer?" But the crowd remained unmoved. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and mocking. A man in a tailored suit leaned over to his companion and muttered, "What's the point? That horse isn't worth a dime." Whispers grew louder, laced with ridicule. "Looks like it's given up on life," a woman in a designer dress remarked, her tone dripping with disdain as she adjusted her pearl necklace. Others nodded, their judgments final. The horse's eyes, once bright with spirit, now seemed dull, empty. His body was a canvas of suffering. His posture slumped, as if the weight of the world had crushed him. In that grand, glittering hall, filled with the elite who saw animals as mere commodities, this broken stallion was nothing more than a spectacle of rejection. No one spared him a second thought, until the unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a chair scraped against the polished wooden floor, breaking the rhythm of cruel remarks. A young man dressed in plain, work-worn clothes, utterly out of place amidst the sea of polished suits and silk gowns, stood up. His voice was steady, quiet but firm, cutting through the noise like a knife. "I'll take him." Heads turned in disbelief. "Him? Are you serious?" A man sneered, his lip curling in amusement. But the young man ignored the chuckles, the shaking heads, the dismissive glances. His eyes were fixed on the horse, and there was something in his expression, something unshakable, that silenced even the harshest critics. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as he approached the ring. After completing the payment, a sum so small it drew more laughter, the young man walked up to the fallen animal. He crouched down, meeting the horse's gaze at eye level. The stallion flinched but didn't turn away. The boy leaned closer, whispering something, words too soft for anyone else to hear. And then, to everyone's shock, the horse's ears twitched. For the first time that night, he lifted his head. The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. "What does he think he's doing?" someone murmured. But the answer would soon become clear. The days that followed were nothing short of astonishing. News spread quickly through the town about the once-forgotten horse, now thriving under the care of his unlikely new owner. The transformation was undeniable. The stallion, once deemed useless, began displaying remarkable strength and intelligence. His gait, once stumbling and uncertain, now carried a quiet pride. His eyes, once hollow, now gleamed with purpose. People who had mocked the young man at the auction started to wonder, had they been blind to something extraordinary? But what had the young man done to ignite such a change in the horse? And why did the bond between them feel so unshakable, as if their paths had been destined to cross? The answers to those questions were about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The morning sun bathed the small, modest stable in a warm, golden glow as the young man, whose name was Ethan, stood silently watching the horse he had named Phoenix, inspired by the mythical creature's ability to rise from ashes. Just as he believed this horse could rise from his past, Phoenix stood stiffly in the corner, his muscles taut, his movements cautious. His scars, both visible and invisible, had built a fortress around his trust. Ethan knew he had taken on an uphill battle, but something deep inside told him this horse was worth it. For hours each day, Ethan sat outside Phoenix's stall, reading softly or simply existing in the horse's presence. He never forced interaction. He knew trust couldn't be rushed. Then, one quiet afternoon, as Ethan sat with his back against the wooden panels, something remarkable happened. Phoenix took a hesitant step toward him. The sound of hooves on straw made Ethan glance over his shoulder, his heart leaping at the sight. Phoenix's ears twitched nervously, but for the first time he seemed curious rather than fearful. It was a breakthrough, but it didn't come without challenges. The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to lead Phoenix out of the stable and into the pasture. The moment the bridle touched Phoenix's head, the horse reared up, letting out a panicked whinny that echoed across the field. Ethan quickly let go, his hands trembling, but he didn't yell. He didn't scold. Instead, he stepped back, giving Phoenix space, murmuring soothing words. It was clear Phoenix's scars ran deeper than physical pain. They were rooted in betrayal. As days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. Ethan would try, fail, and try again, each time making the slightest progress. He began piecing together fragments of Phoenix's story from his reactions. The way Phoenix flinched at sudden movements, the way he froze at the sound of raised voices. It hinted at a past filled with cruelty. Ethan couldn't shake the anger that bubbled inside him at the thought of what Phoenix must have endured, but that anger wasn't for Phoenix to carry. Ethan made a silent vow he would replace every bad memory with one of kindness. One evening, as the sky painted itself in hues of orange and purple, Ethan decided to try something new. He brought out a brush, moving slowly as he approached Phoenix. At first, the stallion stiffened, his muscles coiled as if ready to flee, but Ethan's touch was gentle, his strokes rhythmic, reassuring. Slowly, Phoenix's rigid stance softened, his head dipped slightly. A soft exhale escaped his nostrils. For the first time, he relaxed under human hands. It was a small victory, but to Ethan, it felt monumental. What Ethan didn't know was that Phoenix's transformation was stirring whispers in the town. Those who had mocked him at the auction were starting to notice. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were waiting to see how far this unlikely partnership could go. As Ethan stood beside Phoenix that evening, brushing his coat under the fading light, he felt a flicker of hope. Yet, deep down, he sensed this was only the beginning. Something bigger was on the horizon, something neither he nor Phoenix could yet foresee. The morning mist clung to the pasture as Ethan led Phoenix through their now familiar routine. The stallion's movements had become fluid, his muscles rippling beneath his scarred coat with a grace that hadn't been present months before. Yet as they approached the training ring, Ethan noticed the subtle tension in Phoenix's posture, the way his ears flicked backward at irregular intervals, the slight hesitation in his step. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, running a calloused hand along the stallion's neck. The skin twitched beneath his touch, more reactive than usual. "What's got you spooked today?" The answer came in the form of distant thunder, a low, ominous rumble that rolled across the valley. Phoenix's head jerked up, his nostrils flaring as he scanned the horizon. Ethan felt the immediate change. The relaxed companion of moments before had vanished, replaced by an animal vibrating with nervous energy. The first raindrops fell as fat, heavy splatters on the dry earth. Within minutes, the sky opened up, transforming the peaceful morning into a tempest of wind and water. Lightning split the sky, and Phoenix reared with a terrified whinny, his eyes rolling white with panic. Ethan fought to maintain his grip on the lead rope as the stallion bucked and twisted. "Phoenix, easy!" His voice was swallowed by another crash of thunder. The normally responsive horse seemed transported back to some terrible memory, his movements becoming wilder, more desperate. A particularly violent jerk tore the rope from Ethan's hands. Phoenix bolted, his powerful legs driving him across the slippery pasture toward the far fence line. Ethan's heart pounded as he gave chase, his boots sliding in the mud. "No, Phoenix, stop!" The stallion reached the fence at full gallop. For one horrifying moment, Ethan thought he would try to jump it, a feat that could end in disaster given the wet conditions. But at the last second, Phoenix wheeled sharply, his hooves throwing up clods of earth as he changed direction. His chest heaved, his sides working like bellows as he stood trembling in the downpour. Ethan approached slowly, his hands raised in what he hoped was a calming gesture. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and streamed down his face, making it difficult to see. "It's okay," he called over the storm. "Just the weather, boy, nothing to hurt you." Phoenix's response was a high-pitched, anxious whicker. He danced sideways, his hooves slipping slightly in the mud. Ethan could see the whites of his eyes, the way his muscles quivered with barely contained terror. This wasn't just a reaction to the storm, this was something deeper, something ingrained. Another lightning flash illuminated the pasture and Phoenix screamed, a sound so full of primal fear that it raised the hair on Ethan's arms. The stallion took off again, this time toward the stable, but his panic made him clumsy. As he rounded the corner of the training ring, his hind legs slid out from under him and he went down hard in the mud. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he sprinted forward. "Phoenix!" The stallion struggled to rise, his legs churning the slick ground. Ethan reached his side just as he managed to regain his footing. Without thinking, Ethan threw his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his face against the wet hide. "Easy, easy," he murmured, his voice shaking. "I've got you. You're safe." To his astonishment, Phoenix stilled. The horse's breathing remained rapid, but he stopped fighting, allowing Ethan to maintain his hold. They stood like that for long minutes, man and horse in the pouring rain, connected in a moment of perfect understanding. When the worst of the storm had passed and Phoenix had calmed sufficiently, Ethan led him back to the stable. The stallion walked with his head low, his energy spent. Inside the dry warmth of the barn, Ethan set about methodically drying him off, speaking softly all the while. "You've been through something terrible, haven't you?" Ethan ran the towel over Phoenix's back, feeling the raised scars beneath his fingers. "Not just neglect. Something worse." Phoenix turned his head to look at Ethan, his dark eyes unusually expressive. In that moment, Ethan made a decision. If he was going to truly help Phoenix heal, he needed to know the full extent of what had happened to him. The scars on his body told one story, but the scars on his mind, those were deeper and far more damaging. The next morning, Ethan found Carter in the feed room. The older man took one look at Ethan's determined expression and sighed. "You want to know more about his past?" "I need to know," Ethan corrected. "That storm yesterday, it wasn't just the thunder. Something set him off, something specific." Carter leaned against the wall, his gaze distant. Harlan wasn't just cruel, he was sadistic. There was an incident, a bad one. He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Come with me. There's someone you should talk to." The someone turned out to be Maria Sanchez, Harlan's former stable manager. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, and her face darkened when Carter mentioned Phoenix. "That horse should have been put down years ago," she said bluntly, but her eyes were sad. "Not because he's worthless, because of what Harlan did to him." She shook her head. There was a storm, much like yesterday's. Harlan had entered Phoenix in a high-stakes endurance race despite the warnings. When the storm hit, Phoenix balked at a water crossing. Harlan. He didn't take no for an answer. Ethan's stomach twisted. "What did he do?" Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. "He beat that horse within an inch of his life. Then, when Phoenix still refused, Harlan tied him to a post in the middle of that field and left him there all night in the pouring rain. By morning, Phoenix had torn his legs to shreds trying to get free." Ethan felt sick. Suddenly, yesterday's reaction made terrible sense. That's why he panicked. Maria nodded. "That horse associates storms with pain and abandonment. I quit the next day. Couldn't stand to see it anymore." She looked Ethan in the eye. "If you can heal that kind of damage, you're a miracle worker." As Ethan drove back to the stable, his mind raced. He'd known Phoenix had suffered, but the specifics made his blood boil. More importantly, they gave him a direction for Phoenix's rehabilitation. That evening, as he groomed Phoenix in the quiet of the stable, Ethan spoke softly. "I know now," he told the horse. "I know what he did to you, and I promise you this, no one will ever hurt you like that again." Phoenix turned his head, his soft muzzle brushing against Ethan's shoulder in what felt like acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it filled Ethan with determination. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he truly understood the depth of Phoenix's trauma, and that was the first step toward healing it. The weeks following Ethan's discovery were marked by slow, painstaking progress. He began desensitizing Phoenix to storm sounds, starting with quiet recordings played at a distance while the horse ate his meals. At first, even these faint noises made Phoenix tense, his head jerking up in alarm. But gradually, with endless patience and rewards, the stallion began to tolerate them. Then came the real test, an unexpected summer thunderstorm that rolled in one afternoon as Ethan was working Phoenix in the round pen. At the first distant rumble, the horse's head shot up, his body going rigid. Ethan saw the panic start to build in his eyes, that wild, trapped look that preceded a full-blown meltdown. But this time Ethan was ready. "Whoa, easy boy," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. Instead of trying to restrain Phoenix, he began moving with him, mirroring the stallion's anxious pacing. "I'm right here, we're okay." Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Phoenix's breathing came in short, sharp bursts, his nostrils flaring wide, but he kept his eyes on Ethan, his ears swiveling forward and back. Then came the lightning, a bright flash followed by an earth-shaking crack of thunder. Phoenix reared, his front legs pawing at the air. Ethan stood his ground, arms outstretched. "It's just noise, Phoenix. Just noise. You're safe." To his amazement, Phoenix came back down on all fours instead of bolting. The stallion was trembling from head to tail, but he remained in place, his gaze locked on Ethan, as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "That's it," Ethan encouraged, stepping closer. "Good boy, so brave." He reached out slowly, giving Phoenix every opportunity to shy away. But the horse didn't move, just stood there, shaking, as Ethan's hand came to rest on his neck. The moment stretched, the rain pouring down on them both. Then, with a shuddering sigh, Phoenix lowered his head and butted it gently against Ethan's chest. It was as clear a gesture of trust as any Ethan had ever received. He wrapped his arms around the horse's wet neck, pressing his forehead against Phoenix's. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You faced your fear." As the storm raged around them, man and horse stood together in the center of the round pen. No longer just caretaker and animal, but true partners who had weathered a trial together and come out stronger for it. When the clouds finally parted and sunlight streamed through, Ethan led a dripping but calm Phoenix back to the stable. The stallion walked with his head high, his stride confident despite the ordeal he'd just endured. It was as if a weight had been lifted, as if by confronting his worst memory with Ethan by his side, Phoenix had finally begun to let go of the past. That night, as Ethan mucked out the stall, Carter appeared in the doorway. He'd witnessed the entire scene from the barn, but had wisely stayed out of the way. "You know," the old trainer said, leaning against the doorframe, "in all my years working with horses, I've never seen anything like what you did today." Ethan shrugged, pushing the wheelbarrow forward. "I just stayed with him." Carter shook his head. "It was more than that. You didn't just help him through his fear, you showed him he could face it and survive. That's a gift few people have." He paused, then added, quietly, "Harlan would have beaten him for that reaction. You gave him comfort instead." Ethan stopped working and looked at Carter. "That's the difference between us, I guess. Harlan saw a disobedient animal, I see." "A survivor," Carter finished. "A fighter." He pushed off from the doorframe. "Which makes me think it's time for the next step." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What next step?" Carter smiled. "It's time to see what Phoenix can really do when he's not held back by fear. Time to let him run, not away from something, but towards something. Toward his future." As Carter walked away, Ethan looked over at Phoenix, who was watching them both with quiet interest. The stallion's ears pricked forward when he met Ethan's gaze, as if he understood what was being discussed. Ethan smiled and reached out to scratch behind Phoenix's ear. "You ready for this, boy? Ready to show the world what you're really made of?" Phoenix blew out a soft breath through his nostrils, a sound that Ethan had come to recognize as agreement. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The broken horse and the quiet young man who had refused to give up on him. The morning of Phoenix's first real training run dawned crisp and clear, the sky a perfect blue with no trace of the storms that had once haunted him. Ethan stood at the fence of the large pasture, watching as Carter adjusted the lightweight saddle on Phoenix's back. The stallion stood calmly, his ears flicking occasionally as Carter worked, his breathing steady. "You sure he's ready for this?" Ethan asked, rubbing his palms against his jeans. Carter gave him a knowing look. "He's been ready longer than you think. It's you I'm worried about." Ethan exhaled sharply. He knew Carter was right. After months of rehabilitation, Phoenix was stronger than ever, his muscles lean and powerful, his coat gleaming despite the scars that would always mark him. But the real change was in his spirit. The hollow, defeated look in his eyes had been replaced by something bright, something alive. Still, the thought of pushing him further made Ethan's stomach twist. "He's not just any horse," Carter said, tightening the girth. "He was bred for endurance. It's in his blood. And after everything he's been through, he deserves to know what he's truly capable of." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He stepped forward, resting a hand on Phoenix's neck. The stallion turned his head, nuzzling Ethan's shoulder as if sensing his hesitation. "You want this, don't you?" Ethan murmured. Phoenix blew out a soft breath, his dark eyes steady. Ethan took that as his answer. With Carter's help, he mounted, settling into the saddle. Phoenix shifted beneath him, adjusting to the weight, but he didn't tense or resist. Ethan gathered the reins, his pulse quickening. "Easy, boy," he whispered, "just like we practiced." And then, with the slightest pressure from Ethan's legs, Phoenix moved forward. At first, it was just a walk, steady, controlled. Then a trot, his hooves kicking up small puffs of dust. But as they reached the far end of the pasture, Ethan loosened the reins slightly, giving Phoenix the freedom to choose his own pace. The stallion didn't hesitate. With a powerful surge, he broke into a canter, then a full gallop. The wind rushed past Ethan's face, his heart hammering in his chest as the ground blurred beneath them. But there was no fear in Phoenix's stride, only strength, only joy. He ran like a horse who had finally remembered what it meant to be free. Ethan laughed, the sound lost in the rush of air. He leaned forward, his hands light on the reins, letting Phoenix guide them. The fence at the far end of the pasture approached fast, but instead of panicking, Phoenix gathered himself and soared over it effortlessly, landing smoothly on the other side. Ethan whooped, patting Phoenix's neck as the stallion slowed to a trot, then a walk, his sides heaving but his head held high. Carter jogged up to them, grinning. "Now that's the horse I always knew was in there." Ethan dismounted, his legs shaky from adrenaline. He turned to Phoenix, running his hands along the stallion's sweat-dampened coat. "You were incredible," he breathed. Phoenix nudged him with his nose, his breath warm against Ethan's cheek. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future where Phoenix wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. A future where the scars of his past didn't define him, but proved how far he'd come. Word of Phoenix's recovery spread far beyond their small town. Stories were written about the miracle horse, who had risen from neglect to greatness. Offers poured in, buyers willing to pay 10 times what Ethan had spent, trainers begging to work with him. even invitations to compete in prestigious events. Ethan turned them all down. Because this was never about fame or money, it was about Phoenix. Instead, Ethan and Carter began working with other damaged horses, using the same patience and trust that had saved Phoenix. The once quiet stable became a sanctuary, a place where broken creatures were given a second chance. And Phoenix? He became their ambassador, a living testament to the power of resilience. Years later, on a golden autumn afternoon, Ethan stood at the fence of the pasture, watching as Phoenix grazed peacefully. The stallion was older now, his muzzle flecked with gray, but his spirit was as strong as ever. A young girl, new to the stable, her own horse skittish and fearful, approached hesitantly. "Will he ever be like that?" she asked, nodding toward Phoenix. Ethan smiled. "If you give him time, trust, and love, he'll be even better." Because that was the lesson Phoenix had taught him, that no creature was beyond saving, that pain could be overcome. Sometimes, the most broken things became the most beautiful. And as Phoenix lifted his head, meeting Ethan's gaze across the sunlit field, there was no need for words. Their story had already been written, in scars, in storms, in the unshakable bond between a man and the horse who had saved him as much as he'd been saved. And it was only the beginning.